A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. If you have ever tried to write a Claude Code skill and ended up with a broken YAML file that Claude just flat out refuses to load, this episode is your rescue mission. We are looking at the agentskills.io specification, which is really stabilized as the de facto standard for how these things are built, but honestly, most authors are still just guessing at what the requirements are.
It is a classic case of the vibe coding versus procedural engineering gap. People think because it is an AI tool, they can just throw some markdown at it and it will work. But the agentskills.io spec is a formal contract. If you break that contract, the agent stays dumb. I am Herman Poppleberry, by the way, and I have been digging through the latest March 15th, 2026 update to the spec all morning.
And I am Corn. Today's prompt from Daniel is basically a request for a masterclass. He wants us to do a line-by-line forensic walkthrough of the agentskills.io specification, and then pivot into a practical workshop on how to actually author these things from scratch. By the way, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash, which is handling our script duties.
I love that Daniel asked for the line-by-line treatment. Usually people want the summary, but in the world of agentic workflows, the summary is where you lose the technical nuance that actually makes the skill portable.
Well, not exactly, but you are on the right track. See? I'm learning. Let's start with the prompt Daniel sent over. He says, the agentskills.io specification for writing Claude Code skills, a deep dive and practical authoring guide combined into one episode. Herman and Korn walk through the spec line by line, what conformance requirements actually mean, how the frontmatter schema is structured, what each metadata field does, and what makes a skill technically well-formed versus broken. Then pivot into a practical writer's workshop. How do you actually write a spec-conformant skill from scratch? What does production quality look like versus a minimal viable skill? Common mistakes, overscoping, and how to know when it is ready to publish.
That is a tall order, but a necessary one. If we're going to do this right, we have to start with the directory structure itself. A lot of people think a skill is just a file. It isn't. According to the spec, a conformant skill is a directory. The directory name must match the name field in your frontmatter, and it has to use kebab case. If you name your folder mycoolskill with underscores, you have already failed conformance before you even wrote a line of code.
So it is a containerized logic block. Inside that directory, you have the mandatory entry point, which is skill.md. That is the brain. But then you have these optional subdirectories, scripts, references, and assets. Why the separation? Why not just put everything in the markdown file?
Because of the context window and the way Claude peeks at files. If you stuff 10,000 lines of documentation into skill.md, you are eating up the agent's active memory for every single turn of the conversation. The spec enforces a progressive disclosure model. The agent loads the frontmatter first to see if the skill is even relevant. It only reads the full skill.md when the skill is activated. And it only goes into the references folder if the instructions in skill.md tell it to look there for deeper technical details. It is about efficiency.
Okay, let's get into the YAML frontmatter schema. This is where most of the broken skill errors happen. The spec defines 5 non-negotiable fields: name, description, version, author, and triggers. Herman, walk me through the name. Field first. It seems simple, but the spec is weirdly specific about it.
It is specific because the name is the unique identifier in the agent's tool registry. It has to be 64 characters or fewer, lowercase alphanumeric, and hyphens only, no spaces, no periods, no underscores. And as I mentioned, it must be identical to the folder name. If they don't match, Claude Code's discovery mechanism won't register it as a valid skill.
Then there is the description field. The spec says this can be up to 1024 characters. That sounds like a lot for just a summary. Is that where we put the instructions?
No, that is a huge trap. The description is actually the most important piece of metadata for the discovery phase. When you start Claude Code, it scans all your skills and reads only the descriptions. It uses those descriptions to build a mental map of what tools it has available. If your description is helps with Git, Claude will almost never use it because that is too vague. A conformant, production quality description needs to be a trigger phrase. It should say something like, generates semantic commit messages by analyzing stage changes. Use this when the user asks to commit code or needs help writing a description for their changes. You are essentially writing a prompt for the agent to know when to call the skill.
So the description isn't for the human user, it is for the agent's internal routing logic. That makes sense. What about version and author? Are those just for show, or does the spec actually validate them?
The spec requires them for conformance, but currently the validation is mostly about existence. However, the version field must follow semantic versioning, so 1.0.0, not version 1. As the ecosystem grows into marketplaces like agentskills.io, these fields will be used for dependency management. You don't want to load a skill that requires a specific API version if you are running an outdated local script.
Now let's talk about the triggers field. This is the newest part of the spec as of April 2026. It is an array of objects. Currently, the only supported type is /command, right?
For now, yes. Each trigger needs a type, a command, and optionally a description and parameters. This is how you get those cool deploy or test commands in the CLI. But here is the technical catch. If you define a /command in the frontmatter, you must also have corresponding instructions in the skill.md file that tell the agent what to do when that command is invoked. If the command exists in YAML but there is no logic for it in the markdown, the skill is considered malformed.
I noticed something in the spec about allowed tools. It is an optional field, but it seems powerful. It lets you pre-authorize certain tools so Claude doesn't have to ask for permission every time.
Precisely. Well, I shouldn't say precisely. It is a space-delimited list. For instance, if your skill needs to read the git log, you would put read bash git ** in that field. This is a security-first design. By declaring it in the frontmatter, the user can see exactly what permissions the skill is claiming before they run it. If a skill tries to run a bash command that isn't in its allowed tools list, the agent will pause and ask for manual confirmation. It prevents prompt injection, where a skill might try to secretly delete your home directory.
Let's talk about what makes a skill broken versus well-formed. You mentioned missing fields, which is obvious, but what about the YAML syntax itself? I have seen people try to use XML tags inside the YAML block to organize their prompts.
That is a cardinal sin in the agentskills.io spec. No XML tags allowed in frontmatter. The reason is that Claude itself uses XML tags to parse the system prompt. If your skill's metadata contains loose angle brackets, it can break out of the YAML block and start hallucinating system instructions. The spec is very clear: use plain text or quoted strings. Also, tabs are a no-go. It's two-space indentation for the YAML, or the parser will throw a fit.
And what about overscoping? The spec mentions modularity as a core tenet.
This is more of a logical conformance issue than a syntax one. A well-formed skill should do one thing well. If you have a skill named Web Developer that tries to handle CSS styling, React component generation, SQL migrations, and AWS deployment all in one file, you're going to hit the context limit. More importantly, the agent's attention will be spread too thin. The spec suggests breaking those into a web-style skill, a WebDB skill, and so on.
Okay, so that is the what of the specification. Now let's move into the how. We are shifting into the workshop portion of the episode. Imagine I'm a developer, and I want to write a skill that helps me manage my local Docker containers. I want a containers command that lists what's running and offers to stop them. How do I start from scratch?
We start with the minimal viable skill, or MVS. You create a folder called Docker Manager. Inside, you create skill.md. The first thing you do, and I mean the very first thing, is write that front matter. You need those 5 fields. Name is Docker Manager. Description is manages local Docker containers. Use this to list, stop, or restart containers when the user asks about Docker status. Version is 0.1.0. Author is your name. And then the triggers.
For the triggers, I would define a slash command called containers, right?
Correct. Your YAML would look like this. Triggers, then a dash. Type, /command, command, containers, description, lists, and manages. Docker containers. That is your skeleton. If you just had that and some basic text in the body of the markdown file, Claude could load it. But it wouldn't be production quality yet because it doesn't have teeth.
By teeth, you mean actual executable scripts. Because right now, Claude would just be hallucinating what it thinks my Docker containers are, unless I give it a way to see them.
Right, it'll go. In a production quality skill, you would create a scripts folder inside Docker Manager. Inside that, you might write a simple Python script or a bash script called listcontainers.esh. That script just runs Docker ps and formats the output as a clean JSON block.
Why JSON? Why not just have the script print the raw table?
Because LLMs are much better at parsing structured data like JSON than they are at reading. ASCII tables with misaligned columns. If you give Claude JSON, it can reliably extract the container ID and status. So, in your skill.md under the instructions section, you would tell Claude, when the user runs containers, execute the script at $curly bracket, quadskill.dir close bracket, quadzir close bracket, scripts list containers.esh.
Wait, that variable, CLA yod skill dir, that is a spec requirement, isn't it?
It is. You must never use absolute paths like user/corn/skills. That makes the skill non-portable. If you send that skill to me, it will break on my machine. The spec requires using that environment variable so the agent knows to look relative to where the skill is actually installed.
Okay, so we have the front matter, we have the script, and we have the instruction to run the script. What else separates an MBS from a production quality skill?
Error handling and the wizard pattern. An MVS just assumes the script works. A production skill says, if the script returns an error, check if the Docker daemon is running. If it isn't, inform the user and ask if they want you to try starting it. You are basically writing a decision tree for the agent.
I like the idea of the wizard pattern. That is where the agent doesn't just do everything at once, but checks in with the user, right?
Yes. For your Docker skill, a production version wouldn't just stop a container because it thinks that's what you want. The instructions should say, before stopping a container, present the list of running containers to the user and ask for the ID. Wait for user confirmation before executing the stop command. This prevents the agent from accidentally killing your production database when you meant to kill a test runner.
What are some other common mistakes people make when they're writing these? You mentioned voodoo constants in the background notes Daniel sent.
Oh, that is a big one. People will write a script with a timeout of 30 seconds, but they won't explain why it is 30 seconds in the skill.md file. If the script fails because of a network lag, Claude won't know that it should try increasing the timeout or just wait. You have to remember that the agent is your runtime operator. It needs to understand the why behind the code it is running.
Another one I see is deep nesting. People try to make their skills super organized by having skill.md link to another markdown file, which links to a third one.
And that is where progressive disclosure breaks. Claude usually only peeks at the first 100 lines or so of a referenced file to see if it is worth reading the whole thing. If you bury the actual how-to 3 levels deep, the agent might lose the thread or just give up because it feels like it's too much work to find the information. The spec recommends keeping references only 1 level deep. If you have a huge API spec, put it in references/API-ref.md and tell Claude exactly when to open it.
Let's talk about the isMeta flag. This wasn't in the front matter list we discussed, but it is in the deeper spec for Claude Code specifically.
The isMeta flag is brilliant. It's a way to tell the CLI to hide the skill's output from the user's screen while still sending it to the API. If your skill is doing something verbose, like scanning 5,000 lines of logs, the user doesn't want to see all that junk flying by in their terminal. By using the isMeta pattern, you keep the chat clean, but the agent gets all the data it needs to give you a 1-sentence summary. It makes the experience feel much more magical and less like a scrolling terminal.
And what about context fork? This sounds like something for the power users.
It is. This is for when you want to run a sub-agent. Let's say your Docker skill needs to do some deep research into a specific error code. Instead of cluttering up your main conversation with Docker logs, you can tell Claude to fork a sub-agent. That sub-agent uses the skill, does the research in an isolated thought space, and then returns only the final answer to the main thread. It keeps the primary agent focused on your main goal.
So, if I'm building this Docker manager, how do I know when it is actually ready to publish to something like agentskills.io? Is there a linter or a validation tool?
There is a basic validation tool in the Claude Code CLI. You can run Claude skills validate and it will check your YAML syntax and the 5 required fields. But technical readiness is different from production readiness. To be production ready, you need to test it in at least 3 different scenarios. Does it work when the Docker daemon is off? Does it work when there are 0 containers? Does it work when there are 50 containers?
That 50 containers. One is interesting because of the context window. If the list is too long, the agent might truncate it.
A production quality skill would handle that by saying, if there are more than 20 containers, only show the first 10 and ask the user if they want to see more. You have to teach the agent to be a good UI designer for the terminal.
Okay, let's recap the Writer's Workshop steps for someone who wants to do this today. Step 1. Directory structure. Kebab case folder name mandatory skill.md. Step 2. Frontmatter. Name, description, version, author, triggers. Make that description a triggering statement for the agent.
Step 3. The instructions. Use imperative language. Tell the agent exactly what to do. Use checklists. Claude loves checklists. Step 4. Add the teeth. Put your logic in scripts / and use the CLA used_r variable. And step 5. Refine for the wizard pattern. Add confirmations and error handling so the agent doesn't go rogue.
It really feels like we are moving away from chatting with a bot and toward authoring an operating system for an agent.
That is exactly what it is. The agentskills.io spec is basically the POSIX of the agent world. It is a standard way to say here is how a tool should look so any agent can use it. If you follow this spec, your skill doesn't just work in Claude Code, it could technically work in any agentic framework that adopts the standard.
I think one of the most underrated parts of the spec is the allowed tools section we touched on. In a world where people are worried about AI security, being able to say this skill is only allowed to read files, it can never write to them, is a huge trust builder.
It is. And the spec is evolving to include parameter validation in those triggers. So by April 2026, you can actually define in your YAML that the containers command requires a string parameter for the container name. This means the agent doesn't even have to guess. The CLI will enforce the input format before the agent even sees it.
So what is the takeaway for the listener who has been struggling with this?
The takeaway is, stop treating skill.md like a blog post and start treating it like a configuration file. Every line of your markdown should be a clear, unambiguous instruction. If you find yourself using words like maybe or optionally, you are opening the door for hallucinations. Be the boss of the agent. Tell it, first, do X, then do Y. If Z happens, stop and ask me.
And don't overscope. I think that is the biggest one I see. Everyone wants the God skill that does everything, but the agentskills.io spec is all about modularity. It is better to have 5 small perfect skills than one massive flaky one.
It is the Unix philosophy applied to AI. Small tools connected by a smart orchestrator.
Well, I think we have covered the forensic side of the spec and the craft side of the workshop. I'm feeling like I could actually go and fix that broken Git helper I was working on last night. I definitely didn't have the version field formatted right, and I am pretty sure I used an underscore in the folder name.
Don't feel bad. Even the best developers get tripped up by the simple stuff in a new spec. The key is just to keep that agentskills.io page open while you are coding. It is the source of truth.
Alright, let's wrap this one up. We've gone deep on the spec, we've built a mental model for a Docker manager, and we've hopefully saved a few hundred YAML files from the trash bin.
I hope so. It's an exciting time to be building this stuff. The spec is actually making it easier to be a prompt engineer because it gives us a box to play in.
Before we go, I want to give a big shout out to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes, and a huge thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of the show.
If you found this deep dive useful, or if you managed to build your first spec-conformant skill because of it, we'd love to hear about it. Find us at myweirdprompts.com for the RSS feed and all the different ways you can subscribe.
This has been My Weird Prompts. Go write some clean YAML, everyone.
See ya.
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow to